3. Legality and Revolution. A sharp point of difference between the American and French revolutions is the question of legality and respect for law. In France, various subversive groups worked to produce chaos and anarchy, striving to effect a breakdown of law so that they might profit thereby. Hoodlums and whores were paid to incite mob action. In America, although lawlessness did occur, the leaders of the cause generally opposed it, and historians of the Tory party have noted that, despite the real hardships which the Loyalists suffered, the violence was surprisingly limited in view of the circumstances. The so-called, quote, Boston Massacre, end quote, of 1770 was used by some to incite public feeling. But it is significant that many responsible men were out of sympathy with the rioters, and two very popular leaders, John Adams and Josiah Quincy, defended the soldiers so ably that all were acquitted save two, convicted of manslaughter and only slightly punished. Later, John Adams recorded his dismay at realizing that unprincipled men, like a horse jockey whose attorney he had sometimes been, welcomed the revolution because of the temporary legal confusion it created. He expressed his horror at the thoughts that such men, seeking an escape from law rather than its surer establishment, might gain power. Quote, "If the power of the country should get into such hands, and there is great danger that it will, to what purpose have we sacrificed our time, health, and everything else? Surely we must guard against this spirit and these principles, or we shall repent of all our conduct." End quote. Against this, Adams placed his hope in the character of most Americans and in God. The question of legality was an important one to colonial Americans, but their spirit was not one of barren legalism, but a concern over establishing a righteous cause by righteous means. The Westminster Confession of Faith, in its chapter on, quote, of the civil magistrate, end quote, in common with other religious affirmations on the subject, made civil obedience a Christian duty. Both obedience and disobedience had to be grounded on fundamental law, on God's law, and anything else was sin. Legality was thus a necessity, since it had reference to both civil law and God's law. New England theology in the 17th century formulated, quote, "The central principle of the American Revolution, rebellion against an unlawful act, is not rebellion, but the maintenance of law," end quote. The American revolutionists were by no means perfect men, nor was their cause at all times waged in conformity to principle. But the principles were nonetheless real and on the whole determinative. They were thus, on the one hand, opposed to the deliberate disruption of law and order which later characterized France, and, on the other hand, equally hostile to the temper apparent today in oft-repeated assertions that, because the Supreme Court of the United States has spoken, good citizens have no alternative but to obey. Both attitudes were anathema to them and seen as hostile to the spirit of law. The doctrine of interposition has long legal and religious roots in American history. The doctrine of interposition was advocated by Thomas Jefferson and others as a necessary aspect of federalism, whereby a department of a particular state could prevent the invasion of the reserved powers of state and people by some department of the federal government. In terms of this framework, the federal government was prevented from being the sole determiner of its legality and legitimacy in particular contexts. Although today federal courts do not recognize interposition, it has pre-revolutionary legal roots and a long and successful history since the adoption of the Constitution. Important in this context of legality of revolution was the influence of Vindiciae contra Tyrannos, 1579, held by John Adams to be one of the most influential books in America on the eve of the Revolution. Vindiciae contra Tyrannos held, among other things, to these doctrines. First, any ruler who commands anything contrary to the law of God thereby forfeits his realm. Second, rebellion is refusal to obey God, for we ought to obey God rather than man. To obey the ruler when he commands that which is against God's law is thus truly rebellion. Third, Since God's law is the fundamental law and the only true source of law, and neither king nor subject is exempt from it, war is sometimes required in order to defend God's law against the ruler. A fourth tenet also characterized this position. Legal rebellion required the leadership of lesser magistrates to oppose, in the name of the law, the royal dissolution or contempt of law. All these doctrines were basic to the colonial cause. The legality of the colonial cause was thus staunchly affirmed. William Henry Drayton, in reviewing the early constitutional history of South Carolina, declared King and Parliament to be the lawbreakers, May 1776. He saw the parallel between James II in 1688 and George III in 1776. The Convention Parliament had in 1689 declared the throne to be vacant because of James's violations of office. Because of like violations, the throne of the American colonies was now vacant, according to Drayton. The Convention Parliaments charged James II with breach of, quote, contract, end quote, that is, declared himself to be a feudal, not an absolute monarch. James II, quote, having endeavoured to subvert the constitution of the kingdom by breaking the original contract between king and people, and having, by the advice of Jesuits and other wicked persons, violated the fundamental laws and withdrawn himself out of the kingdom, has abdicated the governments, and the throne is hereby vacant, end quote. The Bill of Rights, December the 16th, 1689, thanked God for the deliverance of, quote, this kingdom from popery and arbitrary power, end quote. The right to bear arms, privileged debate in parliaments, and other long-established rights had been set aside in violation of office by James II. The Bill of Rights defended and upheld, quote, the true, ancient, and indilutable rights and liberties of the people of this kingdom, end quote, and cited the, quote, dispensing with and the suspension of laws, end quote, as a just and legal grievance. The Glorious Revolution thus established legality in terms of the feudal constitution of England while claiming for Parliament royal absolutism. With the first, it gave the colonies an impressive legal precedent to use in the American cause, and with the second, it provided the colonies with the very ground of offence they themselves had suffered under. The legal basis for the American Revolution was thus strengthened, and the constitutional grounds for conflict ensured by that revolution. The fear of absolutism extended to both church and state. It is notable that this was the ground of much hostility to religious establishment in the colonies. Thus, in North Carolina, the Orange County constituency asked that the North Carolina Constitution disestablish the Protestant Church and that Catholics be barred from office by legislation denying public office to any who affirmed, quote, supremacy, ecclesiastical or civil, in any foreign power or authority to grant the divine pardon to any person who may violate moral duties or commit crimes injurious to the community, end quote. Royal and papal prerogatives were commonly seen as essentially one and alike to be fought, and with Milton, many saw, quote, new presbyter as old priest writ large, end quote. Neither Protestant nor Catholic ecclesiastical power nor any kind of statist power were to be tolerated. Absolutism was decried from every quarter, and indications of it challenged. The claim of Parliament over the colonies had been first asserted in 1649 after the execution of Charles I. Massachusetts, which had been ready to take arms rather than surrender its right to Charles I, ignored Parliament's claims. In the 18th century, these claims to colonial power were more aggressively advanced by Parliament. In the ensuing conflict, it should be noted that, whatever the counterclaims of many in that day, the American Tories were predominantly true English Whigs. Locke's Two Treatises of Government, 1689, better expressed American Tory philosophy than colonial faith. The ablest American Tory statement, Reverend Samuel Seabury's 1729 to 1796, Letters of a Westchester Farmer, 1774 to 1775, is a defence of parliamentary authority. In, quote, the Congress canvassed, end quote, Seabury denied the validity of any, quote, strong and lamentable cries about liberty, end quote, since all such rights and liberties, quote, are in a great measure founded, end quote, on the authority of Parliament, end quote. The primary function of government is, quote, security, end quote. Attacking, quote, American Whiggism, Seabury declared that, quote, to talk of being liege subjects to King George while we disavow the authority of Parliament is another piece of Whiggish nonsense, end quote. Seabury affirmed, among other things, first, the supreme authority of Parliament as against king, people and church. Second, he held the rights and liberties of citizens to depend, quote, in a great measure, end quote, on acts or concessions of Parliament. The state, thus, in the form of Parliament, is the basic source of rights. They, quote, ultimately depend, end quote, on Parliament. Hamilton, who as a young man answered Seabury, summed up the colonial position later in The Federalist, quote, it is one thing to be subordinate to the laws and another to be dependent on the legislative body, end quote, number 71. The English Revolution of 1688 had established the supremacy of Parliament in church and state alike. William and Mary had sworn in their coronation oath to govern the kingdom, quote, and the dominions thereunto belonging, according to the statutes in Parliament agreed on, end quote. The colonies, however, were increasingly concerned with the immunities of the individual from the state, and very often from the church, and with the independence of the church. They distrusted Parliament and its claims, but they feared their own legislators no less. They were concerned with immunities and protection from legislative and other state powers. The Federalists recognized the right of revolution against unlawful acts of government as itself obedience to law, reflecting here Vindicii contra tyrannos. The doctrine of interposition was developed as a formal and lawful means to this end. The popularity of Montesquieu in the colonies was due to the fact that he saw, as the true constitution of English liberty, that division and separation of powers which the colonists held to be the essence of their English tradition. The success of Montesquieu, as well as many another European writer, was not in influencing the colonies, but in stating at particular points what the colonists believed, enabling them now, on the basis of international authorities, to buttress their case before the nations. The roots of their conception of law were deep in English and Western Christian history, but they represented also a long colonial development. Massachusetts, for example, had refused in Cromwell's day to accept parliamentary sovereignty, and Winthrop had described clearly the implications of such authority. John Cotton very early stated the Puritan thesis clearly, declaring it wrong to give unlimited or unconditional power or authority to any in church or state. Quote, it is necessary, therefore, that all power on earth be limited, church power or other. It is counted a matter of danger to the state to limit prerogatives, but it is a further danger not to have them limited. It is therefore fit for every man to be studious of the bounds which the Lord hath set, and for the people, in whom fundamentally all power lies, to give as much power as God in his word gives to men. And it is meet that magistrates in the Commonwealth, and so officers in churches, should desire to know the utmost bounds of their own power, and is safe for both. All entrenchment upon the bounds which God hath not given, they are not enlargements, but burdens and snare. End quote. Any and every order of society, being made up of sinful men, will seek to exploit its potential powers to the limit, and must therefore be carefully restrained. As Cotton grimly stated it, quote, if you tether a beast at night, he knows the length of his tether before morning. End quote. Tocqueville was aware of the marked difference between England and America at this point. In the United States, legislative absolutism was denied, as well as the finality of positive law. In England, to the contrary, according to Delhomme, quote, it is a fundamental principle with the English lawyers that Parliament can do everything except making a woman a man or a man a woman. End quote. Tocqueville also cited Blackstone on, quote, the power and jurisdiction of Parliament, end quote, as, quote, transcendent and absolute, sovereign and uncontrollable authority, ecclesiastical and temporal, absolute despotic power. It can, in short, do everything that is not naturally impossible to be done, and therefore some have not scrupled to call its power, by a figure rather too bold, the omnipotence of Parliament. End quote. The powers claimed by the English Parliament from the American view might be acceptable to England, but the colonies had their own parliaments or assemblies and their own constitutional histories. Two legal traditions were thus in conflict. Both had ancient roots, and the colonies were right in affirming that their tradition constituted what was known as English liberty and the rights of Englishmen. They were the truer heirs and developers of that body of doctrine and law. In terms of that legal inheritance, the Declaration of Independence was signed by the representatives of the constituent states in the Continental Congress. Parliamentary power was implicitly denied, and the king declared guilty of breach of contract. In 1779, Congress reviewed the legal documents involved and declared its course to be the legal one in its Observation on the American Revolution. It was affirmed on the basis of these things that the colonies were connected with England only in having a common prince, and also that the Revolution of 1688 had confirmed the right of revolution on breach of contract. Quote, and it being evident that the two countries not only had not, but really could not have, on free principles, any political connection but through the prince, so that exercised in the Revolution of England demonstrated since, and generally admitted, must necessarily draw with it the right to independence, which is above stated. End quote. Justice was thus on the side of the colonies. Parliament's position was implicitly illegal. Power invalid in the king did not become valid in the Parliament's hands, being fundamentally invalid. Absolutism in the king had been rejected as an invalid concept in the English Revolution and the Glorious Revolution. How could Parliament validly appropriate an already invalid power? The American Revolution was thus legal, and it was a move to re-establish law, and illegality by its onus rested on king and Parliament. The difference between the American and French revolutions is again a marked one. In France, the revolutionists aimed at the breakdown of law and order so that they could capitalize on anarchy. Riots and mob violence were essential tools of action. In America, revolution aimed at establishing law. Hence, Edmund Burke opposed North's government almost to the point of treason, convinced that the colonists were fighting for the same cause of English liberty. The defeat of the colonies, he believed, would be a defeat for the cause of liberty in England. Burke's opposition to the French Revolution was thus based on no inconsistency of thought, but rather a recognition of the very different natures of the two revolutions. Many historians since have attempted to reinterpret the American Revolution in terms of a few radical thinkers and have accordingly charged Burke with inconsistency. Burke, however, saw the American Revolution as basically Christian and English in its origins and demands. The rootness, as Burke noted in France, was absent in America. Americans were proud of their roots. When Mary Wollstonecraft, in her French Revolution, observed, quote, there is so much to destroy and almost all to create anew, end quote, John Adams was moved to comment ironically, quote, Joel Barlow, in his history, no doubt on this principle, will record Tom Paine as the greatest politician of the Revolution, end quote. The irony was in order. Neither Barlow nor Paine, nor any other champions of continental and English radicalism had any major influence on the legal development of American constitutionalism. They had concerned themselves with abstract rights. The colonials were concerned with a legal situation. As Adams observed, quote, the authority of Parliament was never generally acknowledged in America, end quote. In matters of empire, Parliament's power was recognized, but not with reference to internal policy. In speaking of rights, the colonists had a particular legal tradition in mind. Again, for Burke, it was an article of faith that man is a religious creature. As a result, the state or government of man must also reflect that religious faith. Burke's political theory was thus, in Mahoney's words, a, quote, basically Christian conception of the state, end quote. Religion is the basis of civil society. Burke saw the American Revolution as a variant of the English Christian concept of society and government seeking to gain its logical development. In America, from, quote, 6 capital sources of descent, of form of government, of religion in the northern provinces, of manners in the southern, of education, of remoteness of situation from the first mover of government, from all of these causes a fierce spirit of liberty has grown up, end quote. To fight America, England, warned Burke, would be fighting itself. Quote, for in order to prove that the Americans have no right to their liberties, they are every day endeavouring to subvert the maxims which preserve the whole spirit of our own, end quote. Americans also saw their cause not only as a defence of their own liberties, but the protection of Englishmen at home from the destruction of their liberties. Thus, a pamphlet, The Crisis, June 1754, attributed to the Reverend Samuel Cooper, held that the destruction of American liberty by parliamentary usurpation ultimately involved the destruction of the essence of liberty in the homeland. This pamphlet was reprinted in London in 1776 as The Crisis, or A Full Defence of the Colonies. Almost a decade prior to Burke's statement of the case, the colonial cause had to a large measure been recognised as valid in Parliament in Lord Chatham's, quote, speech on the Stamp Act, end quote, January the 14th, 1766. Quote, the commoners of America, represented in their several assemblies, have ever been in possession of the exercise of this their constitutional right of giving and granting their own money. They would have been slaves if they had not enjoyed it. At the same time, this kingdom, as the supreme governing and legislative power, has always bound the colonies by her laws, by her regulations and restrictions in trade, in navigation, in manufactures, in everything except that of taking their money out of their pockets without their consent, end quote. Such legal distinctions between internal and imperial legislation may seem legal hair-splitting to another era, but granted that at many points the distinction is difficult, it does not cease for that matter to be valid. For many Americans, liberty depended upon it. At a later date, Americans defended not only the legality of their cause, but also its value to England as well. As Robert C. Winthrop declared in, quote, The Centennial of Independence, end quote, Boston, July the 4th, 1876, quote, we did unite and preserve, we did prevail and triumph, and it is hardly too much to say that we did save England. We saved her from herself, saved her from being the successful instrument of overthrowing the rights of Englishmen, end quote. Finally, one of the revealing facts concerning the Revolutionary era is that the sale of English law books, Blackstone and Coke in particular, was very great in the colonies, nearly 2,500 copies of Blackstone's commentaries having been sold in the 10 years prior to the Revolution. This was not surprising. Legality and the law were of major concern to the colonists, and while Blackstone's doctrine of the omnipotence of Parliament was not always to their taste, the colonial thinkers were concerned with an understanding of law and with legality. Coke accordingly gained, quote, more veneration in America than England, end quote, because of his hostility to the concept of legal sovereignty. But basic to all colonial thought was the ancient and Christian sense of the transcendence and majesty of law. According to John Calvin, quote, the law is a silent magistrate, and a magistrate a speaking law, end quote. In terms of the authority of this silent magistrate, the rebelling colonials moved, and in terms of this faith, their magistrates became speaking laws. Constitutionalism for the colonials meant, as Baldwin has demonstrated with reference to the New England clergy, the absolute and sovereign God and his law undergirding the silent magistrate and the speaking law.